Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 9, The Beginning of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1932. So, hopefully, you have your packet, and as we go along, make sure you fill in the information that you need. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the causes of the Great Depression. And there's always been a lot of research on this issue, but I can tell you right now that it's more than just the stock market crash. So, in 1928, the economy of the United States was really strong, but the stage was being set for a crash. When Calvin Coolidge had declined to run for re-election in 1928, Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. Hoover, just so you know, had been born in Iowa. He had been orphaned by his parents and was sent to California to be raised. His family, if my memory serves me correct, I think were Quakers. And he was kind of raised in the Society of Friends. But he was a pretty bright kid. And as he got older, he excelled in science and math. And eventually he went to Stanford University and got a degree in geology, and primarily to work with the field of mining. And that is where he makes a lot of money. He traveled worldwide, helping mine for different resources. Matter of fact, spent some time in China about the time of the Boxer Rebellion. His family were kind of under a lot of pressure at that period of time because they were in hiding during that era of time. But he's going to come back. He is going to become the food czar during World War I. And by the time we get to, the late 1920s, he is a self-made man. He is very wealthy, very popular with Republicans, and easily wins the election of 1928. He ran against a guy named Alfred E. Smith, who you kind of see the caricature there, but Alfred Smith has the notoriety of being the first Roman Catholic to be nominated for president of the United States. He had been governor of the state of New York, was kind of popular, but in the rest of the nation, his candidacy did not play very well, and part of it being the fact that he was Catholic. And this was a period of time of nativist. Catholics were still kind of thought as being a little bit kind of, I guess you could say, rebellious because of the fact that we had ties to the Vatican and such. And there were a lot of concerns that Alfred E. Smith would probably be taking orders directly from the Pope, and thus that didn't sit well with some Protestant Americans. So he is not going to win the nomination, but when Hoover wins, I should say, doesn't win the presidency, but when Hoover wins the presidency, he does something that no other president had done before, and that is he refuses to take a salary for the presidency because he's a self-made man. He doesn't need the money. He's doing this as a civic duty to his country. He feels that's the best thing that he can offer. So, not long after he becomes president, we're going to have a downturn of our economy. And so after a long period of rising stock prices, which is sometimes known as a bull market, a lot of times we hear about bull markets and bear markets. Bull markets are markets that are making a lot of money. They're moving fast. A lot of times there's a lot of growth within the market itself. A bear market is when people are kind of tighter with their money and the market is not growing and investors probably aren't profiting very much. So this bull market of the 1920s convinced a lot of people to invest in the stock market, people who had never invested before. And by 1929, approximately 10% of the American households owned some kind of stocks. Now, one thing that I would say is this. 10% is not as big as maybe the number that you might see today. I think today there are far more people invested in the stock market, and sometimes maybe even kind of unknown to them that they're invested in the market through maybe a 401k program at work, or maybe through money market accounts that they might have through a bank. But nevertheless, at that time, that 10% was a big number. Many investors bought stocks on what they called the margin, which is basically you put down a small cash down payment or a certain percentage of a loan, and then you owe the rest to the stockbroker. And if the stock began to fall in price, the broker could, trump you, and he could issue what they call a margin call, which is basically he wants the rest of his money, and you would have to repay it back immediately. Okay, well, if the market's growing, there's probably isn't going to be a lot of margin calls, and people are going to be able to pay off that investment. But like I said, if the market turns, that could be devastating to someone, especially if they owe a considerable sum of money, and it will bankrupt people. It will destroy people, and it did when the market fell in 1929. So, in the fall of 1929, in October, stock prices began to decline, and investors sensed some form of danger. By mid-November 1929, the market prices of stocks dropped about $30 billion, which maybe in today's terms doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it was a huge amount of money for the time. When we talk about, the market plummeting, it got to a point where there were 2 days. There was like what they call Black Thursday and then Black Tuesday, which happened in October of 1929. And granted, if you were a person that hadn't borrowed money to buy stocks, yeah, you would take a little loss, but you still might have income to go out and maybe make some purchases when the stocks were going down in price, buying at a discount. And there were some people that made money. Okay, not everybody lost their shirt with the great crash of the stock market. There's always some savvy investor out there, but by far, most people that were, basically playing the stock market by borrowing money were strapped and hurting desperately. You started seeing things like runs on banks. So you see these people gathering in the photograph in front of this building outside. That is probably because they are demanding to get into a bank to withdraw whatever money they have before the bank will fail. So banks were weakened in two ways. They had loaned billions of dollars to stock speculators, people who were playing the market, trying to guess where the market was going to go, maybe not using a lot of wisdom on that. Some who had invested depositors' money in the market, hoping that higher returns would get used for, using money for loans. It all sounds kind of crazy, and it was. There was less credit available, and so the economy went into a recession. And it was such a bad recession that we coined a new term for it. We go from recession to depression because it is going to take us a lot longer to get out of this downturn. A bank run, this takes place when many depositors decide, kind of at the same moment, to withdraw their money from a bank. In this day and age, most banks don't have a lot of cash reserve, meaning like if you would go to the bank and demand all your money in, $20, $50, $100 bills, most banks probably wouldn't be able to cash that out immediately. They might have to go and borrow some money from another bank to do so. But at that time, there was probably a little more cash on hand because we kind of had a cash run economy. But it got to a point where a lot of banks couldn't pay back the money. And thus you could have had a person that put their life savings in a bank, and when they went to the bank to get their money out, there was nothing. And it caused people to do crazy things. And there were stories in, kind of the either late 1929 into 1930, 31, 32, where you'd hear stories about a bank closing and depositors who didn't get their money would jump from buildings and commit suicide. So it was awful. It was a horrible time for that. And some people became very leery of banks because they couldn't trust them. So the stock market crash was not the main cause of the Great Depression. And that's one thing that we need to remember. It's kind of a symptom, but not the cause. The real issues here was that our economy had probably been overproducing, and we hadn't necessarily had a lot of people wanting to buy our products, and thus we had a huge surplus. And because the market was stalled out, not only here in the United States, but in other nations as well, this depression wasn't just like, isolated to the United States. It was a worldwide thing. So it makes it even harder to get out of this cycle. And unfortunately, what's going to be the number one thing that's going to end the Great Depression is World War, which is probably not the best way to resolve that kind of problem, but it did. It resolved it, and it was kind of a bad thing. So most economists agree that overproduction of goods was the key cause of the Depression. When the Depression hit, manufacturers then had to cut production, and it caused widespread layoffs. So it gets to a point where companies, not trying to lay off all their workers, if they were trying to be proactive and trying to be loyal to their workers, might have done something where they would cut the work week back. So rather than a 40-hour week, everybody might be forced to go 30 hours a week. But you might keep your job, but you're not going to be making as much money. And so even if you were a person that kept your job, you were still probably, feeling the pains of not having enough money. And number 10, many Americans in the 1920s bought high-cost items on install payments. In other words, they bought things on credit. And that became kind of popular in the 1920s, but it reached a point where paying off debts forced consumers to stop buying new products. And if you're not buying new products, we're not going to be manufacturing items, and thus we're going to have more layoffs. And so that's kind of where we were at. It just kept getting worse. I guess this is the best way to explain it. If you look at the line graph in front of you here, there's some information about personal income, for our nation at this period of time. 1929, at the start of it, it looks like we were doing good, but as the Depression worsens until we get to about like 1933, people are hurting. And then we see kind of an uptick, and then there's another little recession that takes place about 1937 to 1939. But when we get from like 38, we're kind of amping up for a war. And, in other parts of the world, they were putting people back to work building their war machines. And as you can see, between 1940 and 1941, there's a huge jump. And that's kind of part of that. So, yeah, war finish, kind of ending, economic turmoil. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which, came about in the 1920s, it was meant to protect American businesses by raising tariffs. In the end, it actually caused fewer American goods to be sold overseas, and thus caused a little bit of the problems here that we were talking about with overproduction and not selling the inventory that we had. Low interest rates When we talk about the Federal Reserves encouraged banks to make risky loans in the 1920s and led business leaders to believe that the economy was expanding when it really wasn't. The Great Depression affected the average American because many people were in debt due to risky investments. A lot of people had lost their jobs, and there were some people that were laid off. Stock values dropped so far that people's fortunes were wiped out, and the banks had closed, leading people to lose their life savings. So even getting rid of this car that you see in the picture, you know, you could be discounting it, and people still may not have the money to get, to buy it. So it was kind of bad getting worse, I guess. All right, thank you very much.